Before Islam emerged, the Arabian Peninsula was defined more by terrain than by kings, a region where the desert acted as both fortress and prison. The sands dictated how people moved, where they settled, and how they thought. With no rivers to sustain imperial cities, no monumental capitals crowned with palaces or drilled armies, Arabia relied instead on oases clinging to life between dunes, mountain valleys hiding thin streams, and caravan routes binding these pockets of survival into a loose network. In such an environment, the tribe was not simply a social structure. It was the primary form of government, defense, and identity. Bloodline meant safety, protection, and a sense of place in the world. Without it, a man had no allies to defend him, no lineage to speak for him, and no future. Tribal identity produced a political landscape without a dominant center. Each tribe functioned as its own assembly, court, and military force, ruled not by codified law but by honor and custom. Reputation was a form of currency, and memory served as historical record. Around campfires, genealogies were recited like sacred texts, preserved through poets whose verses traveled farther than most warriors dared. These poets were chroniclers and diplomats, capable of elevating their own tribe's status or wounding an enemy's honor with a satirical line. Vengeance served as judicial mechanism, with feuds spanning generations. A killing rarely ended with the death itself. It triggered cycles of retaliation that could outlive both perpetrator and victim. Elders worked constantly to restrain violence from becoming total, negotiating blood money in camels or goods and restoring equilibrium through ritualized apology. In a world without prisons, exile meant slow death, and sanctuary, once granted, was morally unbreakable. Yet for all its violence, Arabia did not exist in anarchic chaos. It operated on a calibrated system shaped by necessity. 4 sacred months in the lunar year suspended warfare, guaranteeing safe passage for pilgrims and merchants. During these interludes, an alternate Arabia appeared. Markets full of goods from distant lands, poets competing for glory, storytellers preserving lineages, craftsmen repairing saddles, and caravans forming for long journeys across open desert. Mecca stood at the center of this world. The Kaaba, housing numerous tribal idols, turned the city into a sanctuary where even bitter enemies laid down their weapons. From Yemen came aromatics, textiles, incense, and goods tied to Indian Ocean commerce. From the Levant came wines, glassware, weapons, and metalwork shaped in Byzantine workshops. The Quraysh of Mecca brokered treaties with Bedouin groups along trade corridors, securing protection not through soldiers but through webs of obligation and honor extending across the peninsula. Pre-Islamic religion mirrored the political fragmentation. Local gods, sacred stones, and tribal idols dominated spiritual life. Shrines dotted the landscape, some tied to origin myths, others to springs, groves, or rock formations believed to house spirits. Diviners claimed knowledge through dreams, omens, and conversations with jinn, guiding decisions ranging from travel routes to retaliation. Sacrifices sought protection, rainfall, safe journeys, victory in battle, or relief from disease. Yet Arabia was not spiritually isolated. Jewish communities thrived in Yathrib and Khaybar, cultivating oases and maintaining distinct legal traditions and literacy practices. Christian communities prospered in Najran and among northern Arab tribes under Byzantine influence, building churches and participating in theological debates that reached far beyond the desert. Through them circulated stories of prophets, scriptures, and monotheism. A small group known as Hanifs rejected idols entirely, claiming to follow Abraham's religion without formal scripture or clergy. Their presence signaled that the old spiritual order was already unsettled before revelation arrived. Economically, Arabia lay between worlds. Yemen's highlands and Red Sea ports tied Africa, India, and the Mediterranean through incense and spice trade, attracting Ethiopian and later Persian intervention. In the north, Arabs lived within sight of empires, Roman Syria to the west and Persian Iraq to the east. Some tribes served as auxiliaries in imperial armies or as caravan escorts, translators, and scouts. Goods flowed in both directions. Byzantine metalwork, wine, oil, and textiles reached Arabian markets, while Arabian leather, livestock, aromatics, and specialty goods traveled north. Caravans carried more than merchandise. They transported stories of imperial wars, religious disputes, droughts, and distant cities. Through them, Arabia absorbed glimpses of the wider world without being absorbed by it. It remained aware, connected, and confident in the systems it had built for survival, even if outsiders struggled to see them. To the north of Arabia, the late antique world was dominated by two exhausted giants whose rivalry shaped continents, the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire. From Constantinople, Byzantine emperors ruled a realm bound by Roman law, Greek culture, and Christian doctrine, defended by fortified cities and professional armies positioned across key provinces. Syria, Egypt, and Anatolia fed the treasury through grain, trade, and taxation. Orthodox Christianity served as ideological glue, its bishops debating theology in councils whose rulings spread through cities, villages, and monasteries. Roads and sea lanes allowed troops, merchants, and envoys to move quickly, giving the impression of an unbroken Roman legacy adapted to a Christian age. Across the Mesopotamian frontier stood the Sasanian Empire, heir to Iranian kingship and anchored by aristocratic cavalry, Zoroastrian priesthood, and a rigid social hierarchy. Ctesiphon, its capital on the Tigris, housed palaces, ceremonial halls, and fire temples where sacred flames burned under priestly supervision. Sasanian elites fielded armored cataphracts capable of smashing infantry lines with sheer mass, while war elephants added shock and terror. Like Byzantium, Persia saw itself as a universal empire upheld by divine favor, claiming to guard cosmic order against chaos. For centuries, these powers clashed over Mesopotamia, Armenia, and the Levant, burning towns, uprooting populations, and draining treasuries. Neither sought to conquer Arabia's interior, seeing little value in pursuing nomads across deserts that defeated infantry more effectively than battlefields. Instead, both cultivated border states to manage the frontier. Byzantium backed the Ghassanids, Arab Christian federates who patrolled caravan routes and served as cultural intermediaries between Mediterranean cities and tribal lands. Persia supported the Lakhmids in Al-Hira, whose rulers commanded cavalry and shielded the empire from Bedouin incursions. These buffer kingdoms were not mere clients. They built churches, palaces, and administrative systems, proving that Arabs could form states when geography allowed. The rivalry reached a peak in the early 7th century when Persian armies under Khosroes II captured Syria and Egypt, defeated Roman field armies, and seized Jerusalem, carrying off the relic of the true cross. For a moment, Persia seemed ready to dismantle Rome entirely, but Byzantium rallied under Emperor Heraclius, who led daring counterattacks into Persian heartlands, bypassing frontier fortresses and burning crops vital to Persian armies. The war ended with both sides staggering back from the brink with shattered armies, empty coffers, and devastated provinces. On maps, Byzantium and Persia still looked powerful, but appearances hid decay. Byzantine provinces were divided by doctrinal disputes and heavy taxation, especially in Syria and Egypt, which resented distant imperial authority. Persia faced aristocratic rivalry, palace coups, and famine in Mesopotamia, while Zoroastrian orthodoxy struggled to govern a diverse population of Christians, Jews, and minority sects. Both lacked the capacity to rebuild militaries quickly or heal internal fractures. Throughout this struggle, neither empire imagined that a decisive threat could emerge from Arabia. They regarded the peninsula as a strategic vacuum, useful for trade routes and auxiliary cavalry, irrelevant for grand strategy. Even their buffer states were treated as expendable. When Byzantium cut loose the Ghassanids over religious disputes, and Persia dismantled the Lakhmid kingdom, both inadvertently opened desert corridors that had previously been monitored and controlled. These gaps would soon matter. The world on the eve of Islam looked stable to imperial observers. Roman provinces guarded by fortresses, Persian cavalry on the Mesopotamian plains, tax collectors operating in every major city. But beneath this facade, both superpowers were brittle, militarily depleted, economically strained, and spiritually fatigued. They remained formidable on paper, yet vulnerable to forces capable of moving faster, enduring more, and rallying under shared belief rather than bureaucracy. In this atmosphere of exhaustion and complacency, the Arabian Peninsula remained almost invisible to strategists in both courts. No one predicted that the next historical rupture would come not from Europe or Persia, but from a desert society they barely understood. Hardened by scarcity and united, though no one recognized it yet, by language, poetry, trade, and ritual. The old balance still appeared intact, but its foundations were already shifting, and soon the world would learn how quickly an ancient order can collapse when struck from an unexpected direction. And because the empires around Arabia viewed power through capitals and armies, they missed the invisible networks that mattered more in the peninsula. They did not see how the pilgrimage seasons stitched together tribes who otherwise raided one another, how poets turned memory into law, how elders negotiated truces that preserved entire populations, or how merchants transported news across distances faster than imperial riders burdened by bureaucracy. Arabia was unimportant to imperial tax collectors and mapmakers, but it was not unimportant to itself. It possessed its own diplomatic circuits, its own sacred geography, and its own sense of civilizational time, measured not in dynasties but in ancestors and lineages. In the northern frontier cities, Arab scribes served in imperial courts, translating between Greek Syriac and Arabic. In the marketplaces of Syria, Arab merchants bargained beside Armenian traders. Greek sailors and Persian agents. Far from being isolated, Arabian actors navigated multiple worlds, shifting languages and customs without difficulty. But when they returned to the peninsula, they returned to a society that judged them not by their imperial connections, but by generosity, courage, and loyalty to kin. It was a culture that absorbed external knowledge without surrendering internal priorities, a resilience no imperial strategist ever accounted for in his calculations. The interior tribes watched the great wars of Byzantium and Persia with detachment rather than fear. When envoys passed through with tales of victories and defeats, the tribes treated these stories as curiosities, proof that even powerful kings were subject to the whims of fate. Droughts concerned them more than sieges in Antioch, and pasture mattered more than palace coups in Ctesiphon. This difference in priorities created a blind spot in imperial thinking. Empires assumed that populations without interest in their politics were populations incapable of shaping global events. Arabia's indifference was misread as impotence, when in truth it reflected a different world system with its own logic and lifeways. Meanwhile, religious debates in frontier towns stirred questions that would not remain confined to the border. If Jews and Christians could claim prophets, why could others not? If God revealed scripture in the past, why would he not reveal again? If righteous conduct mattered to the Creator, what form should that conduct take? These were not philosophical puzzles for scholars alone, but questions that filtered into tribal conversations through monks, merchants, and storytellers. They merged with pre-existing desert spirituality, dream interpretation, invocation of jinn, belief in unseen forces, and created an undercurrent of expectation. Revelation seemed improbable, but not impossible. The Hanifs, in rejecting idols without adopting foreign religious identities, embodied that expectation. Their presence suggested that Arabia wanted transcendence without surrender, scripture without subjugation, God without empire. They wandered in search of Abraham's faith, not because they sought political revolution, but because they sensed that the world around them was spiritually incomplete. Their numbers were small, but ideas do not require majority to take root. They only require soil that has been prepared even unknowingly by generations. By the early 7th century, the peninsula had become a reservoir of potential rather than a vacuum of influence. The empires surrounding it were strained by war and doctrinal conflict. The buffer kingdoms that once mediated between empire and desert had been dismantled. Trade routes linked south to north, pilgrimage linked tribe to tribe, and language linked poem to memory. Arabia did not need to unify itself by conscious design. It only needed a unifying force capable of speaking to honor, destiny, and God in the same breath. No imperial court foresaw that such a force was about to emerge in Mecca, not through generals or nobles, but through recitation, carried first by voice alone before being carried by armies. When the first verses were spoken in the Hijaz, they entered a world that already understood covenant, already practiced pilgrimage, already debated the unseen, and already stored its authority in spoken word. It was a world that could travel light, endure hardship, and negotiate unity without a king. Within a few decades, the desert that empires ignored would produce a community bound not by blood but by belief. And the frontier corridor that once served caravans would carry armies that neither Byzantium nor Persia could stop. The age that followed would not erase the world that came before. It would weaponize its strengths.